Thank you, Terry. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to come here and have a presentation from the City of Whittlesea. There's obviously a common theme through most of what you're hearing today, and what I'm planning to do is to focus a little bit more on the human aspects of what we're talking about. It's all very well for us to develop strategies, policies, guidelines, codes and standard practices and so forth. But at the end of the day, sometimes we get blinded by that in terms of the actual impact that it has on the people in question. And the characteristics within the City of Whittlesea, very similar to what we've heard already, but this is the main slide that I'd like to get to. This is an indicator of the social impact that's happening in our growth areas at the moment because of a lack of infrastructure. And I'm not just talking transport infrastructure, I'm talking about the whole picture of infrastructure. Whether we're talking human services such as hospitals, respite services, early intervention services, or education facilities like universities, and even things like law courts and so forth. And what we're finding in the City of Whittlesea is that by any measure, and there's a number that are used, you've probably heard of the CEFA index, which is the social and economic indicator for areas. It's essentially a Commonwealth Government indication. That shows that we're the 11th most disadvantaged municipality in Victoria. And I'm sure the other municipalities are in a similar state in terms of where they sit within that league table. And I've put both a red and a green up arrow for the growth areas because I'm confused as to whether growth is good or not. At the moment, it's certainly not, and you've heard that in terms of some of the presentations already, but it has the potential to be good. And certainly if you talk to economists, they talk about growth is good. Economic growth is good, and that's fine, and they expect the population growth will automatically translate into economic growth. That doesn't necessarily happen unless you facilitate that. Everything else effectively is bad news for us, whether you're talking about the standard of education that we have for our young people, the unemployment level, the population or jobs to population, the number of houses that we have that are detached and therefore rely on motor vehicles, and even the number of motor vehicles per household is increasing in our municipality. 95% of our detached houses have at least one vehicle, and over 60%, and it's increasing year on year, have more than 2 vehicles per household. That's an enormous expense on those households, and as a result of that, combined with the high cost of housing, the mortgage stress is resulting in things like mental issues for them, family violence. We're very, very unfortunate to have a police family violence intervention unit recently created in the City of Whittlesea because of that growing family violence. Not a very good indicator of the harmony and the social strength and the networks that we can create in our community. If we go to some of the other issues in terms of things like hack services, 45% increase in hack services over recent years. The community transport, something that's running fairly hot in our local papers at the moment, it's a 2-year waiting list. The same for dental services. These are all basic services that most people, particularly in the established suburbs, would think is quite a right that they should have. And yet out in the outer suburbs of Whittlesea, it's not the case. That's the sort of thing that we shouldn't allow to happen. And it's really incumbent upon all of us at every level of government and the community to do something about it. This is a slide of the DHS services that are within essentially the Melbourne area. And it highlights of the DHS funded services, this is for 2006, there's a concentration of those in the existing areas. And yet if you look at the CEFA index, the Australian Early Development Index, the Melbourne Index for Education and Occupation, that's not where the need is. And yet that's what DHS has done. And we're very fortunate in that regard that in the last 5 years we've managed to get one extra service in our municipality. and that's been established at the moment. It's a respite service. We've been after that for probably about 10 years, and they've only just deemed to think that that's appropriate now. And again, that only came about because of political pressure, and there happened to be an election coming up at that time, and the funding was committed. Not a very good way to plan our municipality or the metropolitan area. This is a CEFA index for Melbourne, and if I can get out my pointer. This is our growth area in the north, and if you toggle between the two, you can see how it went from green to red. Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Oh, well, anyway, so it's toggled between the two. You can see how effectively we've gone from a green area to a red area, and that's happening right around the metropolitan area. So there is a major issue occurring in relation to what we're doing for developing our suburbs in the future. Generally, the public transport deficiencies that we've got are the same as everybody else. Lack of public transport in terms of trains. We've had $1 billion worth of transport investment over the last 7 years. You'd think that's pretty good. $670 million for the South Morang rail extension that Janet has just mentioned previously. That's a 6 kilometre dual track rail, fixed rail system. But $670 million bucks, a lot of money. And we've had over $350 million for the Craigieburn bypass, which is essentially the extension of the Hume Freeway, linking the Metropolitan Ring Road up to the Hume Freeway further north towards Seymour. Massive investment, and yet it's only a drop in the ocean, and it does come back to the question Janet raised about, well, how do we fund these things? And that's the question that I think that is more critical to us than what sort of planning we do in these areas. However, you can't have the infrastructure developed unless you have the land use plans in place to enable you to understand what's required at those times. These are our growth areas in pink, which we have currently got strategic plans for as we see at the moment. Each one of those is at a very, very high level of planning. That's down to the lot level, so that developers can come in and they know what is required in terms of the land zones, and they can start to understand what is required in terms of some of the roads, open spaces and those sorts of things that are required. Obviously what's missing from there is a commitment in terms of some of the higher order social services that we do need. In that situation, there's two sort of red areas that are the town centres, that one to the south and this one to the north. And this is the Aurora estate, which was promoted by Vic Urban at that time, and now it's being run by Places Victoria. Those red areas are required to be fairly high density towards the transitory development process that Janet mentioned. The developer has tried initially to develop those areas with a higher level of residential density. At the time, and it was fairly bold, that's 2001, they proposed, in conjunction with negotiating with us, 15 dwellings per hectare. Now that, as I understand from the GAA, is now the benchmark that they're looking at. Unfortunately, lack of commitment to the rail network that is running up there. This is Epping North, and the rail runs from here through there to the north. With the lack of commitment to that, we're finding that even Vic Urban or Places Victoria is starting to water down the density of their development so that they can sell the blocks. So they started off with good intentions. The commercial reality of what they have to do, where they need to create a dividend back to the government, they've reverted back to a more developer-focused approach to how they're developing Aurora. So as a result of that, despite the fact that it was supposed to be a leading edge, more sustainable estate, it's not working out that way. This is the transport plan that we produced in 2002, and the idea of that was to say, okay, if we're getting this growth going on in the municipality, we need to upgrade our arterial, or generally the transport network. Generally our network has discontinuous east-west roads. We only have two north-south roads, which is essentially the High Street running through here, all the way up to Wallen, and Plenty Road over on this side of the municipality as well. And effectively, they do not have the capacity to accommodate all the growth that's occurring in those two corridors. So we've proposed a number of other roads in that area. That had the sign-off from Vic Roads and the Department of Infrastructure at that stage, which is now the Department of Transport, back in 2002. And since then, apart from some duplication of Plenty Road, which has probably amounted to something like about 6 kilometres of road and costs maybe about $200 million all up, there hasn't been very much progress in that. We've got the wholesale fruit and vegetable market being established in Epping. We have Cooper Street here, which fortunately has been duplicated by Vic Roads in the early 2000s from a two-lane rural road to a four-lane divided road. That now needs to be upgraded to a six-lane road to accommodate the market. There is no commitment to it. So we've got the market which will be opening late next year, and there is no commitment by the government to fund that upgrade. And yet under the former government, the state Labor government, those two projects were tied together. And we haven't heard anything from the current state government committing to continuing with that project. So there's a disconnect between what the government have agreed to in relation to our strategic land use plans, our transport plans and the delivery. Some of the attributes of growth area planning as we see it, the first one is that it needs a whole of government approach to this. There needs to be a commitment from the Commonwealth Government, the state government and local government. It needs to be seamless. At the moment, the funding arrangements across those three levels of government are quite disjointed, and it's more of a case of I will pay for things that suit me rather than I will pay for things that suit the community. And we're finding that as a result that there are gaps in funding between different levels of government. We've got a community activities centre that we're trying to redevelop in the township of Whittlesea. It was a major focus of the Black Saturday bushfires in terms of thousands of people congregating there. The local community, as a result, now want to see that upgraded to include additional facilities, and we're finding that we've got a lack of funding to do that. The upgrade going to cost us $7 million. The government has given us $2.5 million. We, the councillors, got to find that other $5 or $4.5 million. This is a table of the sort of the community facilities that we need over 5-year blocks. The last three columns are 5 years from 2010 to 15 to 20 to 25. And the thing I wanted to really focus on is the primary schools here. We estimate over the next 5 years we need somewhere between 25 and 30 primary schools to accommodate the population growth that we are anticipated to experience. The first part of that growth trend has already occurred because we're beyond 2010 now, and as a result we need that many primary schools. At the moment they're being built at the rate of one every 1 to 2 years. So we're behind the 8 ball. The current government has not committed to anything in the last year, and looks like they won't be committing to anything in the next year. So we're behind the 8 ball there. We've got two of the largest primary school populations in Victoria, and they're running at somewhere about 1,500 primary school children on each of those sites. And it's a normal site that, in theory, with the standards and so forth, would accommodate a population of 350 kids. And okay, a lot of the schools that we all know are probably running at 500 to 600 or so, but in this instance, these two schools are double that. It's just not sustainable. And the other issue with that is that we've identified hospitals and law courts and those sorts of things as well. And when you go to the government and approach them about that, there is no commitment, no forward planning associated with it. So yes, we have strategic plans, but they don't deal with those higher order social services that are an integral part of the sustainability of any community. I've mentioned a little bit about the financing associated with the Whittlesea CAC of that's only $4.5 million for one thing. This is an estimate of the financial deficit that our council is going to be suffering over the foreseeable future. The red line is based on the existing or the former growth area, with all of the growth area plans that we already have in place and approved by the government. The red part is notionally reflecting the new growth area in the Northern Growth Corridor, which has already been touched on a little bit by Janet. Effectively, what it means is we will be running a massive deficit, and yet we're a growing municipality. It is not sustainable. And yet everybody seems to think local government can just absorb these sorts of things. And that's compounded by the natural cost shifting that's going on between the Commonwealth state back to local government. Every day, every week, there is a service that's being further and further imposed upon local government. And we've got intergovernmental agreements to try and resolve that issue, but that's not helping. So, a bit like what Janice said, what we're recommending is that, one, there be an infrastructure development plan in place so that everybody knows exactly what's required and there's a commitment to that. The next thing we're looking at is some form of infrastructure fund, and there's a number of ways that could be used to try and employ that. What we're suggesting is perhaps you could use infrastructure bonds, which are guaranteed by the government. There's a return of whatever percent as a dividend, and there's the private investment into that fund so that people can actually, like you and I, we can actually pay for these things and yet get a dividend. We approached the Department of Treasury about that probably about 4 years ago, and we haven't heard a thing from them. It's just been pushed back as a result of a lack of interest or something like that. But that's the sort of thing that we're suggesting should be put in place, because we acknowledge that there is no capacity for the state government and even the federal government to be able to do that with the current funding arrangements. I personally think taxation should be increased. I think we're wrong that we keep reducing that every election cycle, because we get to the point where we just cannot pay for the things that we expect. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, because I haven't said anything really about transport, and as a traffic engineer that's dear to my heart, effectively I think what others have said is right. Without the transport in the first place, and without that, people cannot get to those other services that I've mentioned, like dental service, respite, mental intervention and so forth, then it's no good anyway. So transport is the key part to this puzzle. And yet at the moment we don't even see the first steps in that area. So on that basis, Terry, I'll finish up.